Jon Grinspan, welcome to the Nightlight. Good to have you with us.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to talk.
Tell me how this book came about. I understand this is a story that you've been kind of kicking around in your mind for a really long time before you started to write the book.
It's funny. The thing about being a historian is the past stays static and the world you live in changes. So I got interested in the story 17 years ago. It was kind of this amazing unknown moment in American history. And it seemed cool and interesting because it seemed random and not connected to the reality we lived in. And over the years, as our politics have changed and become more combative, it started to feel more and more relevant. And, after 17 years of collecting sources and being a kind of wide awake super fan, I decided it was finally time to write the book. And so here we are.
What made you a wide awake super fan? What was it, before we get into who they were and what they did, what was it about you kind of broadly that interested you in them?
Oh, about me? We'd have to get deep into my psychology there. I like that on the one hand, at first blush, they're really inspiring. This is a mass movement standing up to fight slavery. They're kind of the Cape Crusaders you want to come along all through American history, right? And it feels really exciting to learn about these guys standing up. And then as you dig a little deeper, you see that even in this good cause, even in this admirable movement, there are some creepy elements and some scary elements. And I always like my history human, and people who you admire eight ninths and then kind of worry about a little bit as well. I find most interesting. So I found their mixture of inspiration and reservation really interesting.
Yeah, and that ninth it's a big ninth, and we'll get into some of that in a
Yeah.
minute. Before we talk about the group, I read the book. It is a fantastic book. I'm going to be very brazen right up front. And first of all, is there an audiobook of this?
It's coming. Yes. It drops next week or something like that. So I'm very
Good, because
excited about
I,
that.
I was going to beg to be the narrator, but never mind about that.
Oh, no. Next one, Joshua.
This is a really excellent book that I think a lot of people should read, particularly because it puts our politics into a different context from the way we think of the kind of rough and tumble, sharp elbows American politics of today versus then. Let's start with that. What was it like dealing with politics in America back in the like 1830s, 40s, 50s? The way you depict it in the book, it was way more violent, more brazenly violent than we're used to today.
Yeah, I think we have this story of American history that just actually doesn't make any sense if you think about it. That we know we had a civil war, but our image of politics leading up to the Civil War is these kind of genteel men in top hats giving, stiff orations, and it doesn't make any sense. How do these people who were so polite and respectable and genteel end up at war with each other? It doesn't compute. How do you get from politics to war if it's so polite all the time? And the truth is, this is one of the most combative periods in American political history. There's regular violence in the street, in Congress, certainly in the enslaving South on plantations throughout that. That's based on violence, but there's violence well throughout the North, in the Capitol, on the floor of the Senate. So this is a world where there's regular combative tribal politics, not just white versus black and slaver versus free, but also immigrant groups, religious groups, different parties and kind of factions in conflict with each other. So this is a really combative world to begin with, and in some ways, the wide awakes are a solution to that rather than a cause of it.
It was also one of the first times I had heard the word mobbing used as a verb in a book, like the idea that people would just get together and just beat the snot out of other people that they didn't like openly in public in the middle of the street, whether it was for political reasons, I'm of this party and you're of that party, or whether it was nativist reasons and it was just kind of anti-immigrant or anti-Jewish, definitely anti-black, that people just felt empowered to be that openly violent, and that society sort of got used to it. I don't know. In a way, it's scary, but in a way, it's also sort of, it gives context that I think shifts the way I view politics today. But people were just kind of used to it back then, I guess.
They got used to it. I mean, it kind of emerges. It's not that popular in early America, but around the 1830s, partisanship kind of amps up, conflicts over slavery amp up, and at the same time, there's this rise of what they call mobbing, which is mass attacks on some group. It could be anybody. There's certainly the groups we think of, but they're attacks on brothel owners, on saloon keepers, on certainly on Catholics, on immigrants, on African Americans, on abolitionists. There are, I think it's 1,218 mob attacks between 1821 and 1828 and the beginning of the Civil War. That's thousands of occurrences across the country. At some point, people are shrugging their shoulders and saying, "Oh, there goes another mob. I wonder who they're going after." But if you live through those mobs, if you're the target of those mobs, as many future wide awakes were, it makes a big impression, right? And as many leaders were, a lot of people, especially on the abolitionist and African American end of the political spectrum and identity spectrum, experience regular violence in the street, and that informs all of their political decisions.
One of the early ideas you bring up in the book, I believe it's the title of a chapter, is the systematic organization of hatreds. This is one of the areas where I think the book, among many, has so many parallels for today that it's kind of like what I've heard Brene Brown refer to as common enemy intimacy. We don't really like each other, we just hate the same people. That systematic organization of hatreds was one of the things that it sounds like made the Democratic Party, which was solidly pro-slavery, kind of a very corrupt political machine, so easy for Republicans and their supporters to go after. That we reached a point where people were sort of sick of the same forces, and they were just waiting for the right framework to go after those forces together.
Yeah, they built a coalition against themselves. I mean, we have this model of politics, and maybe it's a more optimistic model where people are in politics to make policy changes. And that's very nice, and it kind of works for much of the 20th century. But when you look at the 19th century, and also somewhat today, it's about tribal alliances, and it's about organizing who, as a Republican activist in the 20th century says, who hates who is the determining driver of all politics. Henry Adams from the 19th century says systematic organization of hatreds. That we really see that. There are plenty of people, especially with the Wide Awake story, but across the 19th century, who cannot get along with each other except for the fact that they have a larger enemy, a larger, often tribal enemy, a class, a race, a partisan group. And because the Democratic Party in the 19th century is the biggest party and the oldest party, as it goes pretty wild, as it really digs down into the most extreme version of its base, they really push together all the other elements of society who had nothing in common before these pro-slavery Democrats went so wild and kind of tried to take everything.
Lay out a little more of the political landscape that the Wide Awakes emerged into. You had the Democratic Party, you had this newly formed Republican Party, which had just gone through an election in 1856 that didn't really go very well. You also had the remnants of the Whig Party, which kind of was destroyed by their attempts to compromise over things that kind of weren't easy to compromise over. You had the Know Nothings, which was this thoroughly racist, very nativist movement that went after a variety of people it didn't like. Then you also have these mobs, that were sort of known for street violence. The Plug Uglies, I believe, was one of them. And what is it? The Blood Tubs, like a tub, like a bathtub full of blood. Yeah, they were. Yeah, a name only a mother could love. So you've got all of this weird political energy and all of this tension. And then you have these young men, these like 19, 20 something year old working class young men in Hartford, Connecticut, who begin to feel a way about the politics around them and start to organize. Talk about these guys and what it was that made them think about doing a thing.
Yeah, and Hartford's not where you expect a militant movement to break out, right?
Of
It
all of the
wasn't,
not militant
it
cities
is
in the
not.
country today, Hartford,
No,
Connecticut, just like
yes.
that's not the one.
It's a very nice, peaceful, orderly town. It was one of the wealthiest places in the country back then. I think it probably still is. It's not the heart of this crazy on the ground rough and tumble politics in the 19th century. You go to Baltimore, where people are fighting over slavery, over race, over immigration, over religion. It's bare knuckles. That's where you get blood tubs. Hartford's kind of a calmer place, but what Hartford is it's right on the tier. If you're drawing lines across the country, we know slavery exists in the South. And then there's a chunk of the lower north. So think like Philadelphia to Hartford and the Atlantic Ocean to Chicago. Imagine a box there. Those people are on the fence. They live in the north. They don't practice slavery, but they're still deciding, are they with the Southern Democrats who are really pushing slavery everywhere? or are they with actual abolitionists who want to end slavery? And a lot of them can't decide. There are plenty of white people who don't like slavery as a theory, but aren't going to do anything about it, right? And Hartford is kind of as far north as you can get in that population. These are the guys who are making up their minds. These are the people who are deciding elections. It's also where the most people in the country live. It's got the big cities, New York, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, Brooklyn when it was its own city. So this is the core. And there are these guys in Hartford. They're like 19, 20 years old. They're working class guys. They're clerks in textile stores. And they're on the anti-slavery side of the spectrum. And they're tired, honestly, of getting beat up by Democrats. Every time they try to have a rally, every time there's an election, you end up with a mobbing. The last election in 1856, the Democrats ambushed this Republican rally and blast them with fireworks. But men and women are marching down the street. The Democrats shoot them with all these fireworks. And so the Republicans are pretty mad. In 1860, they're really ready for a fight. They're leaning anti-slavery. John Brown launched his famous raid a couple months before. The country is really fired up, and they, more than really being humanitarians, more than wanting to end slavery because it's an evil act on the ground, or caring honestly, because these are mostly white men who are believers in white supremacy, about African American lives in the South, they feel like they're getting pushed around by Democrats and slave owners. They feel like they're being stepped over. It's that systematic organization of hatreds again. And so they start at this rally in the darkness, in the night in February in Connecticut in 1860. They put on these capes. They make these capes in this textile factory store, these kind of waterproof capes, because they're going to march with torches and they don't want the oil to drip on their nice clothes. And people see these guys in capes in the darkness with torches, and it kind of clicks. It's this dynamic symbol. It looks like they've got verb, energy. They're not trying to look like an army yet, but it looks like Cape Crusaders or something. And so from that first night, where they also get in a fight with Democrats and beat them back in this torchlit parade, they go from there. They get together a group of kids. They meet in a dingy old apartment. They need a name. Wide Awake. It says it all to them. They're finally, they don't say woke, but they're finally woke to the problems in the country. They're finally awake to slavery. Yeah.
We're going to come back to the woke thing in just a second, because that
awesome.
definitely occurred
Great.
to me. But there's two things I take from that. One is that there was an orderliness about the Wide Awakes from the beginning that contrasted dramatically from the genuinely baboon-like behavior that you describe in the book of the way that Democrats comported themselves, even though many Democrats who were in power were super rich and powerful. Like there were a bunch of people kind of at the working class level who were just apes. And then beyond that the Wide Awakes, unlike a lot of Democrats who were getting beaten up, could fight back and they could kick ass. And I think that sort of appealed to people who shared their sympathies or who shared their views, but who perceived the literal physical danger of saying anything. It kind of sounds like it gave the nascent Republicans and just anti-Democrats some cover, some confidence that they could actually do politics in a way that would be defensible, where they could make it home at night.
Yeah, and they make a big deal out of exactly the two things you said. On the one hand, order, and on the other hand, defense. They're living in this culture that feels like political chaos. So there's just mobbing in the street. There's shady deals going on all over the place. Things people believe, rock solid things like slavery wouldn't expand into parts of the country, are being broken every year. And Democrats are fighting know-nothings, are fighting all these groups. European visitors come to America and they say, I can't make any sense out of the politics. There's so many parties with so many crazy names. What is even going on here? Wide Awakes project order. They start digging into this militarism. They wear military caps. They organize themselves into companies. They elect leaders. They get drill books from on how to march with rifles and fight with rifles. And they start marching in Connecticut and Hartford in the dark, doing these drills. They're far from any war. Most of them aren't veterans, but they see this militarism as a symbol of order in a nation of disorder. It's a response to the chaos in their democracy. And it's, as you say, it's a badass response. Like, these guys are fighting back. And for a lot of different populations who feel like they've been walked all over, that is so powerful. That these young white guys in Connecticut can kind of get away with it, but lots of people are leaning in this direction. Fugitive slaves in Boston are started carrying revolvers and fighting back. A lot of people are inching up to this,
Right.
and then these guys in Connecticut are kind of like that final fire.
There's also something you mentioned in the book on page 38 about just the appeal to these young men. On page 38 of the book, you write, in their diaries and letters, these early adopters make clear the appeal of a fraternity, a uniform, a clubhouse, and regular meetings to boys hungry for structure and belonging, especially if you were 22, lowly at work, bored in your boarding house, and looking for something to fill your evenings as winter turned to spring. That feels very familiar to me in terms of a lot of the movements today, whether it's either enlisting in the United States Armed Forces or joining a gang or getting radicalized by some pseudo-Islamic militant group. Like there's something about this appeal to aggressive young men with not enough to do with their energy and feeling frustrated about the world that movements throughout time have seized upon. And the Wide Awakes were no different, except that they fuel that from the inside instead of someone acting on them from the outside.
Absolutely. And they're living in this time where all those anxieties and all that sense of boredom and lack of direction are incredibly amped up. We think of the 19th century as everybody, walking around by candlelight and everything's kind of calm and orderly. This is the shaken society. People are living in a world of boom and bust economy, industry being introduced, mass immigration. Their lives are more shaken and they're more destabilized than any of us or many of us are today. And they don't have a path forward. They're not living in their old villages. Most people don't go to college. There's not like an order to your life anymore. And the Wide Awake say, not only do we want you to march with us, but you can be in our club. You wear a uniform with us. You follow the commands of the leader, or you are the leader, and you really gain status. You're marching through these. They do these torchlit demonstrations, right? And it's a couple hundred marchers or a couple thousand marchers, but it's tens of thousands of spectators. It's all the people in the community. Maybe the young ladies they're flirting and courting with. Maybe the employers, the older men who might hire them.
Oh, there were
The
young
bosses
ladies.
in
The way you describe it, there were lots of young
Absolutely.
ladies in the crowd. They
Yeah.
couldn't really participate, but their presence was vital to keeping these guys going.
Yeah, there's an exchange there, right? And it's not easy to flirt in 19th century America, right? Like you
Right.
can't get away with that in
It's
a
not
lot
really
of environments.
allowed to flirt at all.
No,
Yeah.
no, that kills a woman's reputation, but it's one of the most important things many do, right? Like they need to find a partner, but they can't. I mean, they're kind of locked in this world. These political rallies, these demonstrations, especially because they're so orderly and dignified and respectable, that's cooler than going to a Democratic rally where everyone's drinking and spitting and smoking and fighting. If you're a respectable young lady in Hartford, Connecticut, you usually don't show your face at those because just appearing damages your sense of respectability and cred. You can go to these Wide Awake rallies and it's orderly. They march, they chant in order. They often march in silence, which is incredibly intimidating. If you can think of the image of hundreds of people in matching uniforms with torches marching in silence, and everyone wore hard-soled shoes back then, you just hear their boots kind of on the cobblestones, right? They really build a spectacular scene that is engrossing, and they get something out of it too.
I just flash back to the image of the Unite the Right rally in 2017 in Charlottesville with all these guys in khakis holding tiki torches saying Jews will not replace us. And the contrast from that, which I think immediately, I think to a lot of people made that movement look hollow because the imagery was sort of close, but it was far off enough to just make them look angry and mean, as opposed to the way you describe the Wide Awakes, which made them look extremely disciplined and very focused and still very, very loud. They were not quiet. They brought cannons with them. They would wake people up in the middle of the night. They had chants and cheers and songs, and they did not mind like keeping people up. But because of the way they did it, there are a number of examples in the book where they'll roll into town and people who live like along the train route near the depot would light the lights in their windows and sort of be part of the show. They did it in a way that kind of brought people along and made people want to be a part of what they were doing, as opposed to those thugs in Charlottesville who sort of made people shrink and adapt to what they were doing. The vibe just felt much more effective and enticing.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, having studied these guys for 10 years when Charlottesville happened at UVA, it was like they're bringing back torches. This, no one had done this for 100 years. And to see that idea and I don't want to get too far into this, but the second day of Charlottesville, had they just marched down that lawn and disappeared, I think a lot of us would have had the impression the Wide Awake gave, which is, oh, who are these guys? They're ominous. They're marching in the night. They seem organized. They came out of nowhere. That, for good causes and for bad causes, has a real power. I mean, a lot of the Wide Awake's tricks, you saw them used by fascists too. This idea of having organization, having dynamism, having uniformity. And, the Wide Awakes are marching to fight slavery. They're not marching for these hateful causes that these other groups are marching for. But that sense of surprise, of organization, of dominating public space, of dominating nighttime space, it's really powerful. And in 19th century America, it's a rural nation. It's 80% rural. So if you live in a town of 100 people and 2,000 Wide Awakes march through your town one day in August, it has a really big impact. It's like a multiplier effect beyond what we're used to living mostly in cities where we see a lot of people all the time. It really has a spectacle element to it.
You talk about the Wide Awakes being an anti-slavery group. One of the things that I didn't consider till I read the book, but when you put it in the book, I was like, that makes perfect sense, is the way that slavery was actually kind of a representation for a lot of people of these larger political machines that were in control of the country from this very wealthy, very influential, extreme minority point of view. You refer to it as slave power. Here's one of the things that you write in the book, early in the book on page 7. You write, as early as 1839, abolitionists had started to talk about a slave power conspiracy suppressing the voice of the majority. Usually in history, when movements warn of cabals and conspiracies, they're scapegoating boogeymen. But the slave power was an exception. The slave power was real. It amounted to a pyramid scheme disfiguring American democracy in which 393,975 slave owners led 7 million white Southerners in control of the National Democratic Party, the federal government, and the destiny of 31 million. The 87% of the population who were neither enslavers nor enslaved had to pick a side. But penned in by self-interest, patriotism, white supremacy, electoral tricks, financial entanglements, and open intimidation, they often let the slave power lead. Jon Grinspan, that is, I think, a fascinating way to put this, because it also shakes up some of the way that we view the Civil War, that it wasn't purely about, everyone deserves to be free and equality for everyone, and I, Abe Lincoln, just want to do the right thing. It was way different than that. And it kind of prevents us from sort of having this rose-colored hagiography of the Civil War, that there were more practical considerations that were not really altruistic toward Black folks necessarily at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a minority of people who are abolitionists because they hate slavery. They see it as an absolute wrong, either because they're African American and they oppose it because it's their people being enslaved, or because they see it as a violation of Christian principles or something like that. Like, there's a population like that, and there may be 10% of the population. Then there are people who hate slavery because they think it's evil, but they also like having a country that's held together, and they like all that cotton money that's coming in, and they're also deeply racist, right? Most people back then, you can just assume that they're racist. The ones who aren't are pretty rare. So how do they end up fighting a war against slavery? And honestly, that systematic organization of hatreds kind of explains it, that at some point they come to hate the enslavers, this 2% of the population who owns people, runs the federal government, pushes it more and more every year, and then secedes and breaks up the nation. Over time, these guys really make themselves an easy enemy. And even in the South, most white Southerners did not own slaves. An awful lot of them grumbled about slavery. Some of them become Wide Awakes, which is an amazing thing, these Southern Wide Awakes. And a lot of them didn't want to secede. It really is amazing how this tiny group of people drags a lot of people with them. It's kind of the story of minority rule at its most extreme.
They also got the press involved with them. And the role of newspapers in this story is so wild. Like, every newspaper had a point of view. This idea about journalistic objectivity, and I've talked about this on this show before, is a very recent relic in American history. It did not go back to the beginnings of journalism. It was more of a profit motive than an ideological motive. And to look at it and say, that's the way the news is supposed to be, you don't have to go back much further than like the Associated Press in 1850 to see that is not the way that the world worked. Like there were papers that were very solidly pro-Democrat and very solidly pro-Republican, but they also kind of loved the wide awakes because they were just sort of good for business. And they kind of made themselves a character in the story, which feels very congruent to today, although today almost seems tame in comparison. You write in the book something about how we have our information bubbles today, but back in 1860, those bubbles rubbed together a lot more and made a lot more friction.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, the whole horizon and environment is different. I mean, every year, some editor of some newspaper somewhere in the country is murdered or attacked for what they print in their papers, or their press is thrown in the river because they oppose slavery. There's just constant partisan tension between these papers, and that's what gets people to read them. Americans are amazing newspaper readers back then. People, enslaved people who it's illegal to learn to read are still reading the papers. People are turning out newspapers in parts of the country where there are barely any people, right? There are multiple papers in these small town settlements. And when the wide awakes come along, they're great news. If you like the wide awakes, you can actually help build this movement by writing in your paper, why don't the young men in the next town over form a wide awake club? And the wide awakes will do it, and they'll march by your headquarters, and they'll cheer you. And if you hate the wide awakes, is there anything that sells papers better than saying there's an ominous army of guys in uniforms coming to get you? I mean, we've seen how fear is so useful for the media to kind of sell itself and amp up politics. And there's kind of a little bit of what we saw with the kind of Antifa thing a couple of years ago. There's a sense that these guys are coming, they're going to invade your part of the country, they're going to take over, they're evil, and that sells an awful lot of papers too. So across the media landscape, from Republican to Democrat, the wide awakes are just good business. And so when you look for them in the newspapers today, it's just a flourishing. I mean, we have these newspaper databases that we can search, like Google keyword search basically now. Hundreds of millions of thousands of newspapers. The wide awakes show up a lot. They show up in northern papers, they show up in southern papers, they show up in Republican papers, they show up in Democratic papers. They're just good copy all around.
So why don't we know more about them? I feel like I feel like this story, and there's even more to this, but it's so fascinating. And at the time, people seem to think that like this political movement is going to be written about till the end of time. It's going to go down as the greatest political movement in American history. Every American is going to know who the wide awakes are. And a lot of these young men, as you write at the end of the book, did quite well. They had government positions, and some of them became millionaires. Some of them did very well. Some of them died in the Civil War, but quite a few of them thrived and became part of America's Gilded Age. And we're able to look back on it very fondly. But like, it just sort of disappeared. And I feel like the fact that it disappeared makes a lot of today's political drama make more sense. It's like, oh, no wonder you're mad about this. Oh, no wonder you're shocked by that. You have no idea this happened before. Yeah. We went through this 164 years ago. And to you, it's like breaking news on CNN. Why don't we know about this?
Yeah, there is that sense as a historian. It's like, oh, we're talking about this. I thought we cleared this up already, right?
160 years ago, exactly. And yet now we're still talking about like, oh my God, America's heading for civil war. I'm like, do the reading and then say that again and see if it still makes sense.
Yes, and also look at all the times we didn't have a civil war, but people predicted it. You can find all these moments where people say, oh, we're about to have a civil war, and then nothing happens essentially. So it's not. We shouldn't look only to the worst example in our history as the only context, right? The reason we don't know about the wide awakes, I have a couple hunches. I can't say for sure. It's hard to prove as a historian in absence. Well, for the rest of their lives, they're really excited about it. They have reunions, memorials. Like you said, they basically take over the government. I mean, all these kind of bearded Ohio presidents for the rest of the 19th century were either wide awakes or kind of buddies of the wide awakes. So they're all kind of tied up there. 5 of the 9 presidents in the rest of the 19th century were really closely associated with the wide awake. So they have a good 50, 60 years afterwards. But I think one a lot of these guys serve in the Union Army and fight in the Civil War. And just fighting in the Civil War is a bigger experience. As interesting and cool and fascinating as the Wide Awakes are, it's not Gettysburg, right? Like if you are a veteran of conflict like the Civil War, that looms really large in your life. So it's harder to focus on what you were doing 6 months before the war. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is historians really like to talk about great leaders, right? And so when they talk about the coming of the Civil War, they talk about Lincoln, they talk about Stephen Douglas, they talk about Jeff Davis, these kind of great men of history. That's an easier narrative to tell than this mass movement of basically nobodies around the country. It's much harder to do that history. So I think we focused a lot on that. And also, we have this really cozy code of Lincoln, right? I mean, most of the reasons we like Lincoln are really good. He's the president I admire most. He had huge impact on our country. But it's easier, if you want to talk about the election before the Civil War, to talk about this guy most of us really admire than to talk about these kids in uniforms marching in the night with torches. That's a creepier vision of democracy. That's a scarier version of what the good guys were up to, and also what is our own democracy is capable of. They go from politics to violence much more easily than you would think they would. And so I think it's a darker story, and one we haven't passed down as much because it's not as cozy and easy to tell ourselves as the Lincoln story.
It's also interesting how much Abraham Lincoln intersected with the Wide Awakes when he was still campaigning. Like, they guarded rallies for pro-Lincoln speakers. It's also interesting, Lincoln, at the time, the custom was, you don't campaign for yourself once you're nominated. You let other people campaign for you out of a kind of gentility and civility that it seemed like if you were campaigning for yourself, you looked a little thirsty, right? You look like you should be able to have other people do the speaking for you, which we're not going to have that conversation. But Lincoln also had to make some tactical decisions about what to do with this movement, because these were not Republicans. These were Wide Awakes. So the party couldn't really control them. In some ways, it got dragged behind their organizations where they would like show up at somebody's house and be like, wake up, we're putting you on a train and we're sending you across Pennsylvania to go rally for Abraham Lincoln. We've already figured out the stops. Pack your bags, you've got 10 minutes. And people were like, okay, I'm on my way. Can I have some breakfast? No, come with me. And they would just drag them on a train and take them across. And they did this over and over. So they weren't part of the party. And then as Lincoln is getting closer to actually Inauguration Day, right? He wins in November of 1860. Then the issue is like, okay, now what do we do? People have been screaming about the possibility of a war and secession. This is a very paramilitary looking organization. We don't know what to do with these kids now that they have won us the White House. Talk about how sticky that got, especially because the South immediately started to concretely plan to both secede and attack.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Wide Awakes present an opportunity and a real problem for these Republican Party leaders. Like you say, they just show up at people's houses. The two guys running the whole organization are like 24 and 27 years old. And really, it's on the ground. It's not just unknown politicians, it's young people. It's really kids who've kind of emerged out of their communities. And so you have all these accounts of elite Republican politicians looking out their window in the middle of the night at the Wide Awakes who've come to their house and are standing on their flower garden or whatever. It's not easy for them. They know they have these voters. They need them. Finally, there's an army standing up against slavery, right? It's exactly what people have wanted for so long, but that's a real challenge. And then once secession starts and war is brewing, the Wide Awakes present a really interesting mixed opportunity. On the one hand, if a war is coming, you have hundreds of thousands of angry, organized, uniformed young people in companies ready to go. You have your army, right? If you're a Republican and you want to fight tomorrow, you have your forces ready to go, right? While the South is still, or while Confederates are still getting ready. On the other hand, if you make an army out of this paramilitary partisan force, you might scare away allies you still need, right? There's Democrats in the North who end up fighting for the Union Army against the secession, in the Civil War. Lincoln can't scare them away. There are people in the South who are debating whether to secede or not. States that don't secede, like Kentucky, Missouri, West Virginia, Maryland, there's a whole portion of the country that doesn't go with secession. And if Lincoln starts arming these Republican uniform kind of creepy mass movements, that's going to scare you right out of the Union. So he does this thing that shows a ton of self-restraint. I don't think we admire him enough for what he does there. Lincoln tells him, the wide awakes, not to go to Washington. Don't go to my inauguration. People are writing him, I could have 10,000 armed men at your inauguration in 2 days. You just give me the word, give me a hint, and I'll send the guys with the guns. People are coming up with all these schemes, and his life is in danger. People are already talking about assassinating Lincoln, and we know how that story ends, right? But he says, don't come defend me. Certainly don't go to the South. You can come as individuals, as American citizens. Leave the wide awakes at home. Let's be done with this movement. Because to him, the drawbacks, the people it pushes away, is a worse consequence than having that force ready to go. I think there are a lot of other leaders in world history who would have taken their marchers with them to Washington, and he really shows an incredible restraint there. Even as some others are arming and do really start fighting the Civil War, are ready to go.
Well, and there's also, the fact that Democrats in the South were looking at Republicans through the lens of the wide awakes, and the wide awakes kind of became this proxy for everything they disliked about Republicans and about the North, and saying, see, they've already raised up these little erstwhile armies that are ready to go and invade the South and bring black Republicans that'll take over and they'll destroy our plantations and do God knows what to our white women, and we can't allow this to happen. So in a way, the wide awakes kind of, because things got so much more violent after secession, after Lincoln's election, they almost gave the South the boogeyman the South needed to secede. It's like they started off not wanting to be militant in an organized military way, but because the lines were so blurred, it made it real easy for the South to just ride that wave of emotion, secede, attack Fort Sumter, and then the war was on.
Absolutely. And it's one of those questions we think about a lot in history. How much can you do, or in politics, to benefit your side without hurting your cause with other people? Is there a possibility of strengthening your coalition without driving people away? I mean, there are things like, there's a number of African-American wide awakes in Boston, in Oberlin, in Portland, Maine. It's about 200 people. It's an awesome story. It's really unprecedented. And these guys are really interesting figures. But out of a movement of a couple 100,000, it's not the majority. But as soon as people in the South learn that there are any African-American wide awakes, suddenly the entire movement is entirely made up of African-Americans who are getting ready to come invade and do all these terrible things. And they use it kind of for this disinformation thing. As the wide awakes grow, as they bring in these groups who previously hadn't been able to work together, they also are a benefit to the most radical pro-slavery secessionists who are just looking for an excuse. I mean, there are a lot of guys who are pushing for secession. And really, when secession starts to break out, it breaks out in the really deep South, in places like South Carolina and Georgia and Louisiana. And then these secession commissioners go up to the middle and the upper South, to Tennessee and North Carolina, Virginia, and try to talk their fellow Southerners into leaving. And the arguments they make are, you have to secede. The Union is already broken. Do you look at those wide awakes? Do you see what they're doing? They've already broken the Union. They have an army ready to invade. They have all these evil plans. You have to come with us. The wide awakes have already broken the Union for all of us. So on the one hand, the wide awakes are incredibly motivating, incredibly organizing. They bring all these people together. They help elect Lincoln. And when it's time to fight the Civil War, they're ready to go as the first fighters. On the other hand, they may help push people who are on the fence into the Confederate side of things. There are people in the upper South who maybe do secede because, they're not unhappy with the United States, but they think they've lost their country already. And that's a really compelling argument.
The term woke has become amazingly fraught politically. It was a term that conservatives and many prominent Republicans kind of sullied and changed the meaning of culturally to be this kind of nagging, overly alert, sort of a nag, basically, a cultural and political nag. But you write about in the book, on page 86, a man named Eliza Wright, who writes a pamphlet called An Eye-Opener for the Wide Awakes, where he's not a radical by any stretch of the imagination, at least not as he describes himself. But he writes this pamphlet where he's very laudatory of the wide awakes. It begins with these words: "Bless your young hearts, you of the fresh new generation, the blossoming future American, the America which is to decide whether liberty or slavery shall be universal. You are waked up. Good. You are wide awake, you say. Keep rubbing your eyes, for it is early in the morning with some of you, and perhaps they will open wider. I find that remarkable considering where the Republican Party started in terms of socially conscious, politically active young people and where it is today. I just find that fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe this is true of all parties. They start with so much momentum and zeal, and honestly, I think all these political parties, the metaphor I use is like living in an old house with previous occupants. You might share the same address, you might like the same house, but you're not the same person as people who lived there 100 years ago. The Republican Party today is not the Republican Party of that era. Neither is the Democratic Party or any other party. There's just too much movement over time. History changes things, and it's kind of beautiful in a way. Um, but yeah, I mean, when the wide awakes come along, it feels like an incredible opportunity, and everybody, even the people who hate them, get why they're calling themselves the wide awakes. They get this metaphor of awakening, of being woke, and it's not a surprise that we're using it today. I think you're right. I think a term over time maybe loses its control over itself, and it's obviously being manipulated, similar to how the wide awakes were manipulated in 1860. But it's interesting how exciting and stirring the wide awakes are for people who've been watching this fight for years, especially people on the abolitionist edge of American politics. Never thought they were going to win an election. They don't really know how to end slavery. They never win. There's an abolitionist party called the Liberty Party. It never wins a majority in any county anywhere in a presidential election. And then all of a sudden, you have hundreds of thousands of people who seemed like kind of people to be worried about, these young, angry white guys marching to end slavery, or marching to fight slavery, rather. It feels like an incredible opportunity after decades of fighting the really hard fight. A lot of these guys say, whoa, we have to take advantage of this because they're finally wide awake.
Dig in on that, because I think one of the interesting things, and you note this in terms of some of the, and you referenced this earlier, the very deep racism of some of the young men who started the Wide Awakes. You mentioned that there was particularly one banner in Waterbury, in Hartford, and parts of Connecticut that said, "Land for the landless, not niggers for the niggerless." So these were not people who believed in the equality of black and white. Indeed, if anything, they believed that the pox of slavery was creating a greater incentive for blacks to seek the North and to integrate with the North, which was sort of the same thing in reverse that you said. If there are any blacks in the Wide Awakes, then there might as well all be black. It's that idea of the order of things, the union of things is the way things should be, and slavery as a way of exerting undue power prevents us from having the social order we want. It was not altruistic. However, that also allowed all kinds of people to join the Wide Awakes. Black people in a movement that started with a bunch of racist white dudes. Immigrants, German immigrants, or people from Europe who had watched some of the fights for liberty in various parts of movement. Italians, women, Jews, abolitionists, atheists, all kinds of people kind of ended up in this weird kind of Frankenstein coalition, which feels very different from today, where so many movements demand ideological purity. And I feel like for a lot of the movements that may be very well intentioned and even well thought out, and they may even have valid arguments, I can't help thinking, just as an observer, God, y'all are just shooting yourselves in the foot because you're demanding this 13-point loyalty pledge from people before they can ask you questions. It's like history has shown us that you need to bring a lot of people together without purity in order to move anything forward. And the Wide Awakes are probably like the most potent example of that.
Yeah, they're really a model. I mean, this is how you build a coalition without tearing it down. We have so many models today of people tearing down their own coalitions. And the way the
Before the
Wide Awakes
coalition
do
is
it,
even really formed, really. Like, you can't
yeah,
even form the
yeah.
coalition because you can't find enough people who can get a perfect score on the test.
Yes, and these guys would not agree. The head of the Wide Awakes in St. Louis is this guy Frank Blair, who's a nasty racist descendant of this elite Southern family. He grew up knowing Andrew Jackson. He ends up in the KKK later. He's really not a very palatable guy. He's a wide awake because he's pissed off at the slave owners. He's not a slave owner himself. And he forms a wide awake company there, a really fighting wide awake company with these radical German revolutionaries in St. Louis. You go across the country to Boston, you have African American wide awake companies made up of fugitive slaves led by this guy, Lewis Hayden, who escaped slavery himself in Kentucky. These two people, Frank Blair and Lewis Hayden, would not have been friends, would not have been allies. The only thing they couldn't sit across the table and talk to each other as equals. The only thing they agree on is their enemy, which are the slave owners who are controlling America. And they're really, a lot of times we complain people aren't articulate on policy. They put policy aside. The question is not, what are we going to do about slavery? The question isn't even where is slavery going to expand into New Mexico or into Kansas. The question is, do we want to elect a leader who wants to fight slavery? That's it. And this is how Lincoln wins. Lincoln wins in a four-way race when the country is just broken into factions. He wins with 39% of the popular vote. This is not a landslide. This is a country which is so divided that if you can get 39% of the people to agree on one thing, you can win. And I will also say, you mentioned kind of the racism of these original guys. It's really searing. I mean, that slogan you mentioned, it's not just in Connecticut. You see it in Lincoln's hometown, in Springfield. You see slogans like that everywhere. I really think when we talk about the 19th century, we have to start with the assumption that all of these people are deeply racist and move on from there, because sometimes we are shocked. And honestly, this is the universe they're living in. So the amazing thing is that any of them could manage to get along for any amount of time. And I think the wide awakes are a model of doing that.
One of the things I
Oh,
don't.
I'll say one other thing,
Please,
Joshua.
please.
Sorry. And most importantly, I know some people kind of roll their eyes at this kind of backpedal or quieting on the issues or trying to build a friendly coalition among people who hate each other. But the wide awakes and Lincoln win. No anti-slavery candidate had ever won before. They're the only chance of this. And they win. They win the presidency, and ultimately they win the Union and the war and end slavery. And if they couldn't win the election, none of those other things are possible.
You do note in the book that Frederick Douglass is a frequent critic of the wide awakes because he's not sure that they go quite far enough. And in 1860, because he is a black man who has more than $250 to his name, he is allowed to vote in Massachusetts, casts his vote for someone else, but still notes that the chance seems the strongest with Lincoln. One other thing about the early days of the Civil War that I think is worth noting, and I know I got to let you go in a minute, but I also did not realize, and I always kind of knew, like, if you ask people, where did the fighting in the Civil War begin? The obvious answer is Fort Sumter, right? Fort Sumter was attacked in 1861, soon after the inauguration. The southern states had already begun seceding in the time between the election and the inauguration. But Fort Sumter was kind of a bloodless battle. They shelled it for a long time, but nobody got hurt. They kind of shot at it until they could take the fort and knock down the American flag there. I did not realize, and this is, I think, the big caution for all of us, that the actual violence of the Civil War didn't start in South Carolina. It started in Baltimore. There was a fight in Baltimore as Union soldiers from Massachusetts were trying to pass through the city because the train line didn't quite go all the way through. They had to get off, go to another stop, and then keep going. But it started in cities, in Baltimore, in St. Louis. Like, it was civilians, it was everyday people whose enmity boiled over, and that's where the bloodshed started, not on the battlefield.
Yeah, I mean, I think we suffer from this blue-gray version of the Civil War, where you imagine the Civil War as guys in blue uniforms and guys in gray uniforms on a field in Virginia. And it's actually, people know the Civil War was awful, but it's a little anodyne. It's a little clean, the version that you teach to children, basically, of the Civil War. And the war does start at Sumter, right? Once the Confederacy, once Charleston fires on the federal government at Fort Sumter, the war is on to some degree. But no one's hurt. The bloodshed happens, as you say, in Baltimore, where these anti-wide awake gangs basically rile people up to attack federal troops. And then on the other side of the Union, in St. Louis, where these wide awake clubs get guns, start training, and attack the pro-Confederate side there. So the bloodshed is really, we talked about mobbing at the beginning of this discussion. There's this building sense of chaotic on-the-ground politics that leads directly into civil war. It's not like they say, politics is over, let's start civil war tomorrow. One leads continuously to another. It's a constant evolution of politics, of political clubs, of organizations, from politics into warfare. And the wide awakes are often the turning point. They militarize the St. Louis guys who start fighting. Their enemies are the ones who lead the fighting in Baltimore. And if we think about things like the African American soldiers in the Civil War, like the famous 54th Regiment, they start as wide awakes. And the turning point is going from quiet civilians or underground civilians to these public marching guys with uniforms. It's not the guns, it's not the violence, it's somewhere along there they get from politics to warfare through these clubs. And I think that's the key element that we miss when we make it about guys in blue and guys in gray on a field.
Early in the book, you make one of the points that I think sort of sums up the story, and then you kind of build further through that. And I want to wrap up with this. You write on Roman numeral page 14. I think it's a 14. I think I know my Roman numerals, XIV. That's it. Yeah, 14. You write on that Roman numeral page, whichever one it's on, we're going to call it 14. The wide awakes demand that we ask, where exactly is the line between symbol and meaning, free speech and public menace, politics and violence? Democracy exists to restrain such violence. Open, managed competition is supposed to safely channel the aggressive energies that usually snatched power for most of human history. Political campaigns turn war into sport. But democracies also need to draw out participation from their citizens. And in 1860, wide-awake Republicans discovered militarism's unparalleled ability to excite the public, pantomiming the aggressive energies their system was meant to restrain. It worked, electing a bold new president and drawing out one of the highest voter turnouts in U.S. history. And yet, it all looked like coercion to their opponents, beginning a spiral that would end in war. Democracy's contradictory imperatives, pacifying and mobilizing, crashed into each other as the wide awakes and their rivals rewilded the forces that their system was meant to tame. Jon Grinspan, before I got to let you go, I feel like there is so much in this book that is a cautionary tale about the nature of American politics and maybe lessons that we keep having to relearn about what is effective and then what is wise. What do you think surprised you the most? What did you learn that was the most illuminating to you now that you've researched the wide awakes more thoroughly?
I think the way politics leads right into warfare. I used to understand the wide awakes as this mass movement. They win an election, they go home. But the way these guys became paramilitary clubs and then the fighters that begin the war or inspire other people to begin the war really makes me question a version of democracy we've told ourselves. I think that quote kind of demonstrates it. We've told ourselves a really nice fairy tale of democracy, which is that it solves all our problems, and if we just get enough democracy, we'll behave nicely. And you think about 20 years ago during the War on Terror, we talked about the democratic peace theory, that democratic nations are better neighbors and behave better than autocracies. And maybe that's true. And we talk about threats, authoritarian threats to democracy today, and we kind of have this sense that democracy is a cure-all, and we're worried about authoritarianism. And as much as I think we should be worried about authoritarianism, democracy itself is not easy. That it can be ugly. It can motivate really bad energies in us too, because it's based on competition, and that competition can bring out the worst in people. So I guess the big takeaway from the wide awakes is you really can't draw an easy line between this positive system of government that's the best option we have and this thing that agitates people into war. What is a club? What is a force? What is politics? What is violence? What's a military symbol? What is a uniform to begin fighting? These easy lines we've drawn in our head are a lot harder when you're actually looking on the ground at what these people are up to in the run-up to the Civil War.
Jon Grinspan is a curator of political history at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. The book is called Wide Awake: The Forgotten Force That Elected Lincoln and Spurred the Civil War. Mr. Grinspan, this is a fantastic book. If you need a reader for the audiobook, my number is 202. Never mind. But this is actually a great book. Whether people read it or listen to it, I hope they at least hear the lessons within it. I am so edified by having read this book, and I'm so grateful to have had a chance to talk to you today. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Joshua.